All right. Hey, everybody. This is Jimmy Nunez, Bay Area Regional Manager at Common Sense. I want to really thank you all for coming today. Today, we have the pleasure of connecting with Miss Heather Callihan. She's a technology specialist at, I'm going to botch it just a minute ago. Heather, is it Grand Island? Is it Northwest School District in Nebraska?
Yep.
But really, this is a space over the next 20 minutes where I encourage folks in the chat as well as the community that's actually here to participate in this really engaging conversation. So, Heather, thank you so much. I want to just start with actually asking you, and again, this is a Q&A, so we're going to make it super informal, but I really want to start with the actual definition, right? What do you consider, what is your actual definition of engagement?
My
So can you start with that? And I'm sorry, I'm going to acknowledge your presence in a second, but can you just kind of give us what exactly are we talking about when we say engagement?
I think engagement is just instilling that variety in what you're teaching, and then just getting keeping the curiosity, keeping kids curious and wanting to learn more. So they're not just consuming, but they're also excited to learn more on their own and expand, not just what the facts or the content that's being shared with them, but that curiosity to learn more and continue to grow, I think is key. And I guess with the circumstances, that's no different than in class and outside of class. We want kids to continue to be curious, whether it's August or June. So
Yeah, I appreciate that. I'm going to challenge you a little bit because I think this is a really practical session. So I'm going to ask you to give me in like 10 seconds your engagement face on camera, and then something that you start from the get-go when you're working with educators or when you're working with students in particular. How do you get that engagement factor in the first 30 seconds that you connect with?
are
Sorry,
you,
Heather, I just wanted to
that's
kind of
okay.
pull you in right in.
Are you talking like virtually or
Yes,
in
virtually.
virtually?
Yeah.
I, I think just keeping it real. Like right now, kids want to know where you're at. They want to know what's around you, whether you've got your own kids at home, whether you have a pet, because that's the first thing they're going to want to do is show you their dolls and show you their pets. And my 7-year-old was outside showing her teacher her frogs this morning. They just want to, you just have to keep it real, and they want to know what's going on. It's like the first time they see you at Walmart, like during the school year, that's like real for them. The teacher does do things, and they are a person outside of the classroom. And so I think virtually it's the same kind of thing. They just want to know you're a real person. You eat lunch, at a table just like they do at home, and you have pets just like they do. So kind of keeping it real. And I think that kind of correlates too with the engagement too. You're going to bring them along with you if they know you're real and that things are similar
I love it.
in the environments.
That's amazing. Well, I wanted to just start that, which is like, let's actually create a collective identity, create a collective definition of engagement, because I think we can go down a rabbit hole when we address that. So, just let's talk about the state of education just for a second. And I want to actually frame the conversation around not the reality of what's happening around the world, but really how our educators have become really resilient during this time. So can you kind of talk about resiliency for a second? I mean, before we get into engagement, can we sort of talk about how the state, the environment in which our educators are being resilient in, and some of the narratives or some of the stories that you're kind of hearing from the
Um,
ground?
I think there's like I don't know if fear is the word, but when you started transitioning to this online learning, um, when you hear the technology, there's that fear of, oh, it's going to fail or kids don't have internet. And those are real things. But when you talk about resilience, it's just trying to find the adaptive way to adapt, whether you make a recording for a student because they couldn't connect, or
Yeah.
they, especially with like middle school kids. I know in our district, we've got middle school and high school kids that are responsible for caring for their younger kids, and they may not be able to connect. They're caring for siblings and those types of things. And so I think there's a direct correlation in resiliency and flexibility, and being able to keep that variety going of, it doesn't have to be synchronous. They don't have to be on the same time. But if you have videos like you're recording this right now, there's people that can't tune in at this specific time because they're doing exactly what I just said, working from home, caring for others, doing
Yeah.
different things. And so anytime we can help assist with that resiliency, I think that helps. I just think it's that
Super.
variety and that willingness to be flexible.
Super appreciate that. And I think I appreciate that notion that we are thinking about the whole experience of that child, right? And you had mentioned something when we first chatted, and I want to kind of go back to that. We talked about this state in education being sort of a triage state. And so kind of as we start thinking about tips for educators around how to keep engaged, how do they do that with the backdrop of this triage education where we're piecemealing what education looks like, we're trying to transfer the physical space online? Can you kind of talk a little bit about that, sort of like the backdrop of what engagement looks like during this time?
I think one of the things that I saw a lot of is and it's not anything, it's not anybody's fault, but you were quick to try to put expectations on the learning environment. And I think that it's important to realize that in a typical classroom, as an educator, you have a lot more control of that environment. So if there's a distraction, a lot of times you can take it away. If there's something going outside, you can shut the blinds. It's very nonchalant, and it could be nonchalant, but you can take that distraction away because you have control of that environment. You're handing the desk is something you give
Yeah.
them. You provide them the desk. If you need to take away a distraction, remove the chair, you have that control. And with this shift, students are choosing their educational environment. They're choosing to, connect to you from a bedroom or connect
Yeah.
to you from an office or a basement, or sometimes they might be outside, depending on what it is. And that being said, come different distractions that we no longer have control over.
I'm with you on that.
So I
Yeah.
think,
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
no, I'm just saying sometimes that's difficult.
Yeah.
And so you mentioned engagement, and I think that's what just takes that level up a little. It's a little bit harder because kids have those distractions. You can't shut the blinds because the garbage truck's driving by. You can't shut the blinds because there's a bird, standing outside the window. It's just real.
Yeah.
And so you have to find ways to engage those kids with it. What are you looking at, and make that learning connection to their environment as opposed to maybe a typical textbook, I guess.
That's amazing. I really appreciate it. And one of the things that you mentioned is like the whole experience. And I don't want to go down this rabbit hole, but I'm super curious about engaging parents, right? Like there's a number of comments on the chat around sort of how do you ensure that parents are also being engaged, right? So if I teach kindergarten, for example, what are ways that you are supporting parents to feel engaged in the process as well? So we'll get into tips in a second, but I
Okay.
just wanted to kind of get your quick reaction. So
I I we're doing such a great job as educators right now front loading parents with information. And it's not anything different that we haven't done in the past. You have your open house nights and you give parents the seesaw accounts, you give them access to your Remind, you give them access to your curriculum sites and things like that. And I feel that sometimes not all parents engage on that right away. And right now, we have done such a great job of front loading them, and it's the here and now. We need to embrace the fact that our parents are involved in this education many times more than they ever have
mhm.
been. They know what's going on, they're hearing the conversations. And I think the other piece is we've always wanted to create a common language in education, and we do as teachers. But because sometimes parents are hearing these Zoom sessions, they're reading these online textbooks, they're reading the communication coming from the
Oh
school,
yeah.
that there's now this new sense of common language from educators, from schools to parents, and we
Completely
need to
agree.
embrace that. Yeah, we need to embrace that. And I think moving forward, we also need to celebrate the things that this situation is bringing to us. And this is one that I think we're focused on here, or at least myself personally is focusing on, is we've really done a great job of creating that common language with parents and front loading them. So moving forward, hopefully when we get to more face-to-face stuff again in the fall, parents will have that language. And so when you provide them those resources and continue to front load them, they're all on board,
Absolutely. Yeah.
and it'll just continue. So I think it's a great perspective of an unfortunate situation.
Yeah. Geez. You know what? One of these days I'm going to go to Nebraska so we can like barbecue or something together. Your family, I mean, I'd really appreciate sort of how you are so welcoming for this experience. Okay, let's get into it. Let's really get into these tactics, right? So we wanted to promote these 3 tips, but I really wanted to start asking you if I only have 10 or 15 minutes, what are the top 3 sort of very high level or mid level? What are the top 3 things that you think educators should consider when they are engaging with kids? And maybe if you want to name all three of them, and then we can kind of go back and kind of, you can delve a little bit deeper in. But if I were to say, like, Heather, give me your top three, what are they at the top of your head? What would it be?
And you mean like on the online, the virtual type environment?
Yeah.
Obviously variety, and I know variety can take a lot of different shapes and sizes, but just from what I've seen, I've watched my kindergartner, her teacher incorporate like brain breaks, movement brain breaks. Again, we're not doing anything different than what we do in a regular classroom. It's just how does that look transitioning it to online? And so that consistency of, oh, we did brain breaks in the classroom, now we're doing it online. And I think that consistency helps too with that engagement. It's not anything different. It's just that instead of standing up, I saw my 7-year-old yesterday, she was standing on a chair doing the brain break, dancing around. Teachers do a lot of engagement when they invite readers into the classroom. They have guest readers and guest people come in. And I've seen a lot of guest readers. My 4th grader at my house was a guest reader in a kindergarten classroom. So again, they're not seeing that same face
Yeah.
on the stage all the time. Kids are used to, I'm with my teacher for a while. I might go in with an interventionist. I might go into PE and have a different teacher.
Absolutely.
And now it's hard. It's really hard to do that. And so giving yourself that grace to say, you know what, that 4th grader might want to read. Our superintendent recorded himself reading a story, and
I love
that
it.
was presented
I
on
love
Seesaw too. And again, it's just that variety and that creativity. But I'm not sharing anything earth shattering. That's the other thing. It's like these are things that you're only as good as the people you surround yourself with. And
I,
I'm blessed and lucky to be surrounded by amazing people, learn from resources. All these people that are joining in right now, you all have tips and tricks and things that you're sharing, and people, whether you know it or not, people are gaining those things. And so, I don't feel like I'm sharing anything earth shattering. It's just trying to think about the things you're doing in the classroom already to provide that engagement, that variety, and what that looks like online. And sometimes it's simple, change
yeah.
the reader to somebody different, or I don't know. One of the other things, you said 3. One of the other things I've noticed is incorporating show and tell. And show and tell is not necessarily something that teachers do a lot of in the classroom, because people are bringing in stuff and there's liability with stuff getting taken, or you don't want them to bring their expensive items. But when you're in their homes, I guess, in their
Yeah.
houses, those things are right there. Those are the distractions. So why not use the distractions to your advantage and have them share stories? It's practicing that oral fluency. They're sharing and describing what they have in front of them, that type of stuff. They can share stories, and then you can do follow-up after that. Again, nothing earth-shattering. It's just kind of thinking outside
You're
the
too
box on
humble,
what that
Heather. You're
can.
too humble. So I just want to recap. I think so. What I heard you say is taking breaks, kind of making it really modified, being able to differentiate, kind of have different faces on there, and then this idea of show and tell, but that encompassing the actual physical space and transferring it into maybe the online space. I want to challenge you a little bit to kind of ask, like, do you think that applies to maybe the senior that's graduating? Or, I want to push, there's some folks here from even higher ed universities. Can you is that same modeling, like, would that sort of apply in those spaces? Do you think that sort of would work?
um the brain breaks are going to definitely look different. It might be a game, where they're using a deck of cards instead of like dancing around with Go Noodle. Your littles love that kind of stuff. But I still think the show and tell type thing, and I don't know that you would call it that, but kind of, embracing the fact that you want to be involved in their environment. My 10-year-old had show and tell today in her Zoom, and she was thrilled because they don't always get to do that. So I just think it looks different. If you're at the college level, they want to show their kids, you're educating adults that have kids or pets, or other people in their homes, spouses, those types of things. And so I think that just provides that ownership and that buy-in a little bit
You're good, Heather.
differently.
You're good. I appreciate that. You mind if I challenge you a little bit more, make it really exciting at this point? Yeah.
Sure.
Just so we don't
Sure.
have to go back and forth webinar style. I thought maybe I can give you a round robin of like 10 hypotheticals or maybe even less, like 5 hypotheticals that we are starting to see. And folks in the chat, if you have these hypotheticals in terms of how teachers become distracted, feel free to share. But hypothetical number 1 is, non-verbally, what I'm sensing is that that student is actually looking disengaged, right? You might have that like face on
Mm-hmm.
them, you know, that
Mm-hmm.
it gives you that cue, that non-verbal cue that they are not participating. How might you engage that particular student when they're online? Maybe that student has been like, is like over Zoom, or they're like
Mm-hmm.
Zoom bored or whatever. There's so much fatigue related. How might you sort of engage that?
I think sometimes um, you have kids that just don't want to show their environment. They might be embarrassed by what's behind them. Um, they just got out of bed. And so you have to sometimes tiptoe around that. But I think the chat is helpful. Sometimes they don't want to talk with everyone in the group. It's embarrassing or whatever. And so chatting on the side, utilizing tools like Flipgrid where you've got that two-way, you can have that two-way conversation where you can still see them. Kind of goes back to that variety, I guess.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's just that need to, it is sometimes an inconvenience as an educator, but sometimes you just have to have that Zoom, that one-on-one Zoom, or bring them in with another individual. Maybe
Yeah.
there's their friend, and you bring them in and you have a Zoom later with just those two to just kind of see what's going on and kind of gauge their learning and have that conversation of what would make their environment better, what would make this better, what can I do? Put the blame on yourself
You're
so
good.
that a little bit, I guess.
Okay, I'll give you the next one. Students are disrupting others during the chat. So how do you address that, but also engage those students? And again, I got two others right after this, so feel free to give me your tidbits.
Oh,
Like Jamie,
sometimes
that's a tough one. So
it's I'd be curious. I should be reading the comments because like I said, you're only as good as the people you surround yourself with. Again, there's distractions everywhere you go. Um, Having a chat, changing up, maybe if they're distracted, you kind of have to sometimes just go back to plan B or have something else in your back. Oh, we're going to switch it off now. Or if you're having guest readers, you just kind of call them on the, ask them if they want to help out with the answer.
yeah,
It's tough because again, you don't have control over that environment. Maybe they prefer the recording. Again, you jump on later, but if they're distracting others, I've seen people turn off cameras.
yeah,
You have that if you're using a tool like Zoom, you could, instead of just calling them out, you could turn everybody's cameras off and then just kind of go audio.
gotcha.
Um, you could invite everyone to create avatars. You could be creative. For tomorrow's session, we're going to have avatars, or your favorite pet's going to be your profile picture or something.
You're
And again,
great,
thinking
Heather.
outside the box.
I really appreciate it. I know that these are off the cuffs. So I think the final question I think for you, and we can move into questions after this, is
Okay.
I really want to, the hypothetical here is actually how do you pace engagement over time, right? So if I'm with my students for like 30 minutes, 45 minutes,
Mm-hmm.
and I want to maintain that engagement, going back to your first point about keeping it real and keeping yourself very authentic, what suggestions or advice do you have to ensure that you stay engaged and you sustain that engagement throughout the sessions that you have with your kids? So
Um, Again, it's just variety.
yeah,
It depends what you're teaching, obviously, but anytime you can have kids interacting with something physical as opposed to just listening to you talk, we're kind of like everyone's out here is just listening to us talk back and forth. But if you can have kids write down something and then show you or pick up something, maybe their instruction is to bring a red crayon, a blue crayon, and a yellow crayon to class,
yeah,
and then you're showing these things, show me five, and they show five, but somehow incorporating those, and those are kind of for your littles, I guess. But as they get older, having that opportunity where you give them something to create or a task to do, and they show it on the screen, or
yeah.
they put it in a chat or something where they're not just drilled to the screen. They have that opportunity to, pick up a piece of paper and show you,
I was
or
just going to
pick up
tell
an
you that.
item.
Yeah, let's model some of that stuff together. So you've certainly modeled keeping it real, and I'll do a show and tell at some point. Unfortunately, we don't have time for read-a-thon, or maybe if my 5-year-old were to jump on screen, we can kind of have a variety of that. But Heather, I want to get into the questions because I think there's some really rich questions on the chat. But before we do, if can you just kind of summarize some takeaways from today's conversation for the audience that maybe is just joining, or if you just want to summarize your 3 main points, I'd love to hear them again. So
I guess my main thing is just going back to surround yourself with other people that have ideas. Sometimes that may seem simple, but you just didn't think about it, as far as ideas for engagement. Embrace the people around you as far as like, talk to other teachers and have those students, you might have, if my 4th grader was distracted all the time, I would encourage a kindergarten teacher to have her read, to them. Use those kids that are distracted as a benefit to another class if you have those connections with teachers. And then I think the big thing with parents is we are so at an advantage with what we are front loading with parents.
yeah.
And to really just put that in your back pocket and run with it in the future, take that as something that'll benefit you. You are going to get a whole new round of kids next year, most likely, but those kids are still coming from this similar situation where their parents have been front loaded with information. So really embracing that. And then when you're sharing resources, the other thing I haven't mentioned, Jamie, is there's so much out there with AR, VR,
Yeah.
and that is so engaging. And so whether that's in a Zoom setting or a virtual setting, or you have those follow-up activities, you mentioned engagement, you might have a short 10-minute Zoom, but then the follow-up activity is something where they're physically active or hands-on, and maybe they're doing something with a Google expedition. They don't necessarily need the viewer to do that, but you can give them those resources and those sites to do an expedition or a YouTube 360, those types of things. So just embracing those too.
You're great. Thanks, Heather. I really appreciate it. Seriously, I think it's real. We will post the folks on the chat. We will post Heather's comments, but I want to get into the questions for a few minutes. And if we don't answer your questions during this time, we can certainly do it when we stop recording. First, the question is around any suggestions you have to engage students who are autistic. And Heather, I want to be in mind that there's 11 questions, so any sort of additional pieces, we won't get to all of them, but I certainly, if there's any quick tips that you have for any of these, I'd love to hear your perspective. So
sometimes I know I've reached out to a couple teachers, and sometimes it's helpful to have an extra teacher or a para on your virtual session with you and have the chat open, because another adult or a teacher can be engaging with a student that needs more support through the chat separately, because you can do that private chat. And I've seen that work well too. Or just if you're somebody that's using like Zoom rooms, breaking out into that. Again, I want to make sure before you do something like that, front load and be familiar with that there's an adult or supervision in there, because Zoom rooms, it's like sending kids out to another room without adult supervision.
yeah.
But utilizing things like that, where students that might need that extra support, just like they do in a classroom, to use that and take advantage of those other adults that can support in your Zoom as well.
Lovely. Last question for you, just for the sake of time, and then folks that have key answers will answer it offline. I'm often guilty of actually having another screen up, and I know this is a question that I resonate with, but is there any thoughts on how to overcome that, both for students as well as for educators? Any sort of final thoughts? Like, how do I keep myself focused? So
keep it short.
Yeah.
Yeah, and pacing, I think. Short and pacing, so they don't have time to get distracted. If you're on for 30 minutes and it's too much and they're getting distracted, have your conversation and then give some follow-up activity they do independently, come back on later. It's just change it up, I guess. That's hard, because we're, as adults, we're just as guilty as kids.
Yeah. I certainly am, for sure. Listen, Heather, this has been a really engaging experience. I'm big on nonverbal, so if you want to kind of give me an affirmation from your end, all the way from Nebraska, if you felt alive by this presence, maybe we'll just take the last 10 seconds to smile at each other. Or if you want to just like not, that'd be great. So do you feel good?
I feel great.
Great.
I feel great.
Hopefully you feel better about yourself. Everybody else on the chat, we will get to the rest of the questions, but I just want to thank everyone for attending this afternoon. And Heather, I really appreciate your presence, and I look forward to chatting with you again. So
awesome.